Okay, welcome everyone to our Movement, Ecology in Times of Crisis webinar tonight. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Fatima and I'm one of the presenters tonight. Great. I'm going to share a little bit about Aini, if you wouldn't mind going next. So Aini means reciprocity in Quechua, which is an indigenous language of communities in the Andes of South America. We're a small training institute here in East Boston that coaches, incubates, and supports social movements and community organizations. We also develop research and content on movement and movement dynamics. And we see ourselves as one organization that's part of creating positive change in our country and around the world. And now I'll share a little bit about the presenters. First, Carlos Saavedra, who is the founder of the Aini Institute. He's been a leader and community organizer in the immigrant rights movement since he was 16. He works to support social movements across the globe to create a better world. Paul Engler is the director of the Center for the Working Poor in LA, is a movement director at Aini, and is a writer who co-authored the book, This is an Uprising with Mark Engler. And Fatima Paulino again, I'm a trainer and a facilitator at Aini that works with US-based community organizations and also have the blessing of working with indigenous leaders in Latin America. Before joining Aini, I was a community organizer in California and was part of co-creating the Cosecha movement alongside Carlos and others. And last but definitely not least, Rodrigo Silveira is a movement educator and works to form alliances with indigenous communities in the Global South. Tonight, he's helping us with our tech, and we're very, very grateful and send a lot of love his way so everything goes well. And now I'll pass it on to Carlos.
Thank you so much, Fati. Thank you so much, Fatima. So my name is Carlos. Welcome everybody to this presentation around movement ecology in times of crisis. Before we kind of get started with the presentation that we have prepared for all of you today, I just wanted to first send a lot of blessings and a lot of love to you all and all of your families and your communities. I know that we are in a very difficult time right now, trying to address a lot of needs that is happening and a lot of uncertainties that are happening because of the crisis we're living today, not just in the US, but all over the world. So I just want to first send love and blessings to all of you and acknowledge the pain that is happening out there. And I also just want to say that for us, we're doing these workshops in order because we believe that actually movements and organizations and people can make a significant impact in protecting people, in actually addressing some of the root problems that this crisis is actually bringing up forward in a more viral or massive way right now. And one of the reasons that we're doing this workshop is we have this concept called movement ecology. We actually do a 3 to 4 day training on this concept. It's also called movement strategy, movement ecology. They're complementary concepts. And what we're going to focus in some of this session is learning about that. I know that some of you are jumping this call already been through a version of the workshop or a version of the training. We're going to try to recontextualize that in the context of the situation we're in. So we really see how Corona is really, the coronavirus crisis, how is that fitting into the movement ecology framework. But if you have not seen, and this is your first time, don't worry, we're going to go over it. We're going to try to teach it from as we do it from the scratch, but try to do it so that everyone is getting some good information around this. And the last things that we will share is some practical steps about how can we all contribute as individuals and some organizations to what we believe is a new emerging movement ecology. So that's what we will focus today. There will be a time afterwards for Q&A. Fatima is going to help us kind of collect everything, as she was saying at the beginning, so that we can answer some of those questions and go from there. So let's get this started. So let's talk about intro to movement ecology. So the first thing that we want to start is that we at the Aini Institute, we've been around now. This year will be our 8th year that we've been around since 2012. And we've been very, we had the honor in some ways of training people across many different issue areas like housing, climate, immigration, criminal justice, all kinds of communities across the country, the working class, people of color, We've been able also to train and work with people in Europe, work with communities there, communities in Latin America, indigenous communities. We've done, trainings of thousands of people at this point. And because of that activity, we are able to see patterns based on seeing so many people. And one of the patterns that we've seen is that there's kind of a leadership path that people go through. There's many of them, but there's one particular that we see, a leadership path where people first start as individuals. They start forming their, saying, look, I am affected by an issue, or I am motivated to join on an issue cause. And I put my mouth, my words, my commitment, and I put my feet, my work. I go lobby at the State House. I go to a protest. I donate money. I do a lot of things as an individual to move this cause that I deeply believe in. Okay, and people have a breakthrough kind of in their path of leadership and have this awakening of joining a movement or joining a cause and really being there. But after a while, some of the people, not everybody has this next breakthrough, but some of the people that already had the individual breakthrough, they kind of stack on the next one. They have a breakthrough, which is that, hey, the issue that I'm solving is actually so much more complex that I need other people. I need an organization. I need to find other people, or I need to find an organization or build my own organization on the issue that I'm working with, because we need more resources. We need more power. We need more leverage. We need more people. We need more skill. And I join an organization. So this is another breakthrough that people have, and they join an organization. And in some ways they have to let go of their individuality or some parts of it to be part of joining the organization and contribute and being there. Again, not everyone has the breakthrough. A lot of people just remain part of the cause, but they just remain as individuals. They don't join the organization deeply. Within organizations, sometimes there's breakthroughs, which is like you're in the lower parts of the organization or the lower rank, and you want to become the leader of the organization because you don't like how the organization runs. So sometimes you build your own, or you become the leader. And then you have other breakthroughs within there, which is how complicated it is to run an organization, sustain it, figure out the membership, figure out how we can all work together. It's a whole work that it really takes, right? But that's a breakthrough on its own. But then after that, maybe you spend a couple of years more working on an organization on a particular issue, and you realize that one single organization is just not enough. For whatever particular issue you're working, you realize that actually you need a lot of organizations to come together and to figure out how they're going to solve the problem that you have. And you become an realization that you need a movement, that you need essentially a collection of organizations working together to push the cause. And this is a whole other breakthrough. Again, as I said, some people have the individual breakthrough. Some people within the individual breakthrough have the organization, and within the organization, they have the movement breakthrough. And then they decide in some ways that they need that. And this is very, very important, because actually we know that a lot of people say, oh, I need a movement, but they don't act like it. What do I mean by this? Is that actually we see that a lot of people see that there's other organizations, but because sometimes there's competition, or there's a sense of I can do this on my own, that people actually don't realize that they need a movement, and that actually they need to be working with others. So as part of INI and the trainings, we also sometimes get invited to meetings with a lot of stakeholders or organizations of a particular issue of cause, are in a room, and we get to see the conversations, and we've been through many of them. And at this point, we see a pattern that at the end of sometimes the 2 or 3 day meeting, there's this big conversation about the next big meet and the next meeting. And the people debate, and they say, is this meeting really important? Should we do it again? Is this meeting the real work? Is it not the real work? They start debating it. And what we see actually is that there's underneath that, there's people that have different breakthroughs. Some people believe only the organization's success depends on just their organization. And some people believe the movement success depends on everyone working together. So then you have this dichotomy where people don't see that there's a need for interdependence. And actually, even if I don't like you, I need to figure out how to work with you because I need you to succeed. So that's the breakthrough of movement. And there's always resistance. If you haven't had it, there's always resistance. We at INI believe that we cannot hold you to a breakthrough. We cannot hold you accountable to a breakthrough you haven't had, or that, if you don't think you need a movement, how can we pursue you on this, right? So in this workshop, we're talking about movement ecology. So just to understand first that what we're saying movement is, we mean this breakthrough understanding. You need this collaboration. And we're also seeing this in the Corona crisis. We're seeing that people as individuals are taking care of themselves, taking care of their families. taking care of other people as individuals. And some people are beginning to having a breakthrough that they need an organization. They're joining mutual aid networks. They're becoming part of the leaders of those organizations. So we can see that. And I'm sure some people are beginning to see that we need many organizations that are having that breakthrough. So that's a little bit of the path. And again, there is sometimes resistance to that. But we are here in this workshop orienting that we need a movement for the kind of response, for the kind of crisis that we're facing right now. So this means that we will respond to the crisis, particularly this one, based on how we orient. And we at INE believe that we cannot hold people accountable to what they're not conscious of, what they haven't understood. Because how can I, if that's, so we have to figure out how do we orient ourselves into understanding that we need this higher levels of collaboration. And when we're working in an organization, it's very different than when we're working at a movement level, because at a movement level, the degree of complexity, meaning the amount of things that happen and the amount of scale, the amount of people, the gravity, the scope of what we're trying to deal with is much greater. And because of that, one distinction, we actually have four, but we're gonna only talk about one distinction that at the movement level happens is that actually movements have many different strategies working at the same time. But most of the times we're not oriented that actually these strategies are something happening, meaning that we don't really talk about them explicitly. We only refer to them implicitly, and this creates a lot of confusion. So we're gonna go through talking about some of these ones. Again, if you've already been through movement ecology, this might feel similar, but we're gonna then add up what's emerging from the crisis so that it gives us some new context. So we think there's 5 different strategies. We also sometimes refer them as well as theories of change. We interchange those words if you see us saying it back and forward. The first one is personal transformation. The second one is alternatives. Then there's the insight game, mass protest, and structure. And we're gonna go one by one. And if people have questions, again, Fatima's here next to me so that we can see the questions. I cannot see all the questions because I'm in the presentation, by the way. But let's go through one by one. So first, personal transformation. Personal transformation is a strategy that believes that when we heal ourselves and we begin our liberation, the world will change. In some ways, if the consciousness of one person changes, the world can change. And there's a lot of institutions that we have, even before the coronavirus crisis, that had been doing that. People that are doing yoga and meditation, people that have been doing 12-step AA work, recovery work, You can also imagine a teacher that teaches his students and figures out that even in this classroom of 30 to 35 students, even if I can get 5 students to really make it, my job as a teacher is done. So they believe that their strategy is a strategy of personal transformation. Also, people doing services, people saying, look, if I can help you not be able to solve the problem that it's out there in the world with all the poverty, but if I can support a few families or 100 families in my neighborhood to get the resources they need, I'm changing the world. So that is kind of what personal transformation is. And these are some of the institutions, there's more, of course, that do some of this work that belong to that part of the pie. I want you to take a second and imagine that whether you're in your room, in your kitchen, whatever part of your home that you're in, that imagine that there's a pie on the floor and that you're putting in one side the people that are in personal transformation. Now, we believe organizations and individuals orient to this particular, that they have beliefs that they are part of that, okay? We are seeing also with the current crisis that there are some new things happening in this particular strategy or theory of change. We're seeing that there is community funds that are happening to provide resources, financial resources for people that might need them. We've seen that people are making masks to support healthcare workers, right? Doing their own kind of sewing collectives to figure out how to support our overwhelmed healthcare system. We're seeing that some teachers are scrambling to figure out how to get students. I heard stories from other friends of their teacher friends that have been, getting computers from the school or getting computers borrowed so that students can actually get into online classes, because not every student has computers to go into online education. We have seen people form mutual aid networks, and within those networks do services of let's help the elderly, let's help people that are maybe immunocompromised, people that are unable to leave home, and support them in that way, right? So those are some of the things that we're seeing within personal transformation that are emerging during this crisis, okay? Let's see. The second one is alternatives. And by alternatives, we mean either cultures, institutions, organizations that are creating alternatives in some ways to serve their communities that differentiate from the status quo. So for example, institutions like a cooperative bank for us is an alternative, right? It's an alternative to regular banking that takes money from, in some ways that's predatory lending on lower income communities. So it's an alternative bank where maybe we share ownership of actually meeting the community's needs. So we see that also with alternative education, with, for example, schools like the Montessori school or other people that are doing different forms of education across the country, right? We see it also with countercultures like punk rock, with hip hop countercultures, where people are really trying to be different from mainstream. When we're saying alternatives, it's a broad category to understand all those efforts that are trying to create a world that we want right now within the conditions of what we have right now, right? And that particular strategy or theory of change believes that if we can create the alternative, right, people will come to it, that we will be able to form something new, and out of the something new, the revolution or the change will happen. Okay? This is a very important belief. Again, we're lumping a lot of people in. So people within that tradition or within that particular segment will say, well, I believe this, I believe that. We're doing some simplification to explain this complexity. What we're seeing emerging during the crisis now is actually we're seeing a lot of mutual aid networks happening all across the country, across different constituency. We're seeing them happen by neighborhood. We're seeing them happen, for example, for undocumented immigrants, as I'm part of a group called Cosecha, that just a whole population we're seeing for formerly incarcerated people, for people that are incarcerated. There's many networks that are popping up that are happening also within the church, in labor unions to help memberships. We're seeing also that there's now a whole alternative way of doing our households, or who the people that you live with, or who you have to quarantine, for the people that are able to quarantine. There's all this kind of new arrangements that are happening for people to form kind of like, okay, we got to withstand the quarantine. How do we organize our food? Who's going to take care if there's children in the household? How are we going to take care of that? How we're going to organize the cooking? There's a lot of those things that are emerging in one way or another in alternatives. I don't know if there's any questions. Yes, there will be a video of the PowerPoint. Sorry, Fatima, I just saw a question. Okay, so we just talked about personal transformation, and we just talked about alternatives, okay? Again, you think there's a pie in the room of your house. We're seeing, for the people that haven't seen this concept before, some of the organizations that are part of that we think orient in that particular thinking. This is just, again, to put some more, we do in our training, people can write down all the ones that they think for their movement or their particular context are in. But now I want to move into this other three: structure, mass protest, and INSA game. And we really think there are three different ones because they express what they want to do very differently, and they believe on things very differently, even though they share the belief that they're trying to do dominant institutional change, meaning that they're trying to work within or outside of dominant institutions, meaning Congress, elected officials, meaning the state, the government, or the market, and they're trying to push them, whether they're pushing them gently or pushing them very intensely, to create change. Okay, so we're going to talk about those three, but they all in some ways clump together. So let's talk about one by one. The first one is the inside game. The inside game is working within the established rules and dominant institutions from the inside. So you can imagine people working within City Hall sometimes. And again, before I reframe this so this becomes really clear, when we mean movement ecology, and when we mean all this spice and these different strategies, we mean people that are trying to create change within their context. So inside game is a particular context. So not everyone who is in the institution is trying to create change. But as I was saying before, imagine the example of the teacher. You have the teacher in personal transformation that is given all those resources, all of its love and work and smarts to get students to advance in the school. Imagine the teacher also saying, well, that's one way. I can do another way. I can form an alternative. I can form an alternative school. Or I can go with my other teacher buddies and form a school. But you can also see a teacher saying, within my school, how can I pressure my principal, or how can I become a principal so that I can change policy for my high school, for my middle school, for my kindergarten, for any of the institutions that I'm in? How can I change? And that is a very different way of doing change, because you're in some ways bounded by the current rules that you have to follow as an administrator and as a leader there, right? Also, we have people, for example, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? That is a progressive leader in the United States that is trying within her position of the inside game to do things for what we consider a movement. We consider her to be on our side of the struggle, right? To push forward. So all those people that are doing that, either at city halls, either at schools, either in Congress, whether they're also advocates that don't necessarily work in there, but are trying to advocate for people to, wrestle their relationships from the inside, we call those people the inside game, or that they're within the inside game. Also, you can imagine people in corporate boardrooms that are thinking about creating change. Of course, I don't know how many they are, but if they are, that would be the context that they're working on. We're also seeing some emerging things happening from the inside game during this crisis. We're seeing, and of course, from the right to the left, from the whole spectrum, we're seeing, of course, from the left, characters like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushing for something more distributed for the working class. Some other organizations are calling it a people's bailout. There's different frames about a whole set of demands that is happening for the state to intervene in the current crisis that we're in. We're also seeing it happening from the other side of the spectrum with Trump and all the other characters. We're also seeing, thousands of lobbyists from some of the major industries across the country actually asking for a piece of the stimulus bill to be to them. And we're seeing also characters like Pelosi and others that are somewhere in the middle on the front. So we're seeing a lot of people in the inside game. There's also a lot of people from within our organizations that are lobbyists or advocates that are talking to mayors, that are talking to governors or governors' offices, that are talking, I don't know how much people are talking to the president, but are talking to national elected officials around what things should be done in this time or another. Everyone who's doing that, we call them the inside game, but these are some of the things that we kind of see emerging. So that's the inside game. Perfect. Let's go into structure. What do we mean by structure or structure organizing? Another way to call it is community organizing, which is probably its most popular name. But by community organizing or structure organizing, we refer to building bases of leaders and organizations to pressure power holders or to pressure dominant institutions to create change. So in structure base, and I've been a community organizer for now most of my life in this country, about how do we find leaders within our community, whether it's a particular constituency or a neighborhood. How do we find leaders? How do we form leadership teams? And how do then we politicize and educate those teams? Or how do people politicize each other in that process to then actually run intense campaigns to be able to gain rights or resources for that particular constituency? So labor unions, for example, are institutions that do community organizing, or what we call structural organizing. Organizations like the United Farm Workers are also part of this tradition or this particular strategy of community organizing. Also, organizations like Faith in Action, formerly the PICO National Network, or even organizations like the Working Families Party, that is organizing organizations in some ways into creating and pressuring dominant institutions to create this change. Okay, there's a particular way now, and it's different from the inside game, because in the inside game, they're working within. And here they're trying to work within, but they're also trying to build power from their constituency to pressure. Since sometimes, or not sometimes, but maybe 100% of the times, we don't have actually the power that we need. So actually we cannot just advocate, we need to pressure and build a base around it. So that's structure organizing. Okay? It's a particular strategy of doing change. We're also seeing emergence of what people are doing from the community organizations during the crisis. We see, for example, in Unite here that they're doing, some organizations are doing massive mutual aid responses within their membership. So in this particular way of doing things, because they're so oriented to the membership, they're first working within the membership, which is how can I protect the membership? How can I mobilize the membership? And that's actually what's happening, We also see that there's new demands emerging around rent zero, about canceling student debt, Also, a local organization that we work with here in my neighborhood in East Boston, Nube, is doing a lot of mobilization of mutual aid and building services and trying to figure out how also be in coalition with others to push elected officials around the rent and other things. So we're seeing a lot of that from community organizations, in the last 2 to 3 weeks People are being mobilized. And let's do the last one. The last one is mass protest. There's another way to do dominant institutional change. And what mass protest is that it's focused on changing the weather or creating large amount of protest or attention to shift public opinion. So these are organizations or networks that actually emerge, planned sometimes unplanned, but emerge and become large temporal organizations. Like, for example, Occupy Wall Street a couple of years ago, after the economic crisis that emerged, and essentially people were doing encampments all over the country. It created a humongous attention to the issue of economic injustice. You know, it really polarized people around this issue that people hadn't been polarized as much before. If you look at the polling, and you know, we have some in the resource guide that you can see about this particular polarizations and mass protests do, how it affected. But we have seen it with Black Lives Matter, as well as a movement that really took a lot of streets. Not just did that, but one particular strategy that Black Lives Matter did was mass protest. Recently, we've seen it in Chile with a major mass protest movement where people there took over the streets and been taking over the streets now for many, many months, doing general strikes, doing mass mobilizations. So this particular way, we call it mass protest, of a very particular belief. People in the inside game are not the same people that are in mass protest or realize the strategy. They're going for similar things, but they're going about it very differently, right? We're seeing a lot of mass protests emerging in these times too. We're seeing that people are doing a lot of wildcat strikes. I know this one is about the bus drivers, but there's been also about the sanitation workers. There's been, I'm sure people have been following the Amazon and Instacart workers. There's a lot of wildcat strikes happening. This is what we would call mass protest activity, where this is not coming from the top down that is informing this activity. There's not leadership at the top saying to everybody, let's strike at the time. There might be, but after there's pressure from the bottom, people are actually organizing. There's actually thousands of workers in some instances that are organizing this work stoppages in this moment throughout this crisis. So we're seeing a lot of mass protest activity. We're also seeing that people are adapting because of social distancing. So I've been seeing some people doing this, driving a car around Capitol Hill. So you're still within your car, and in some ways you're honking and calling attention to a particular issue, you know, like I think they call it car-ins or drive-ins. I'm not sure of the particular name. I just saw it the other day. But we're seeing some creative action. And we're also seeing that at different places, what has happened in Europe and in Asia and other areas, that people are doing, you know, go at 8 p.m. at night and open your window and cheer for the healthcare workers. We're seeing some mobilization of people, in some ways really protesting, in some ways saying that the healthcare workers matter. Because in some ways right now, we're also getting a lot of messages from the whole country, including people that are now don't want to get quarantined, or a lot of elected officials that say they don't really matter. You know, we don't need the resources for them. So we're seeing some mass protest activity emerge there. Great. So let's summarize it and kind of bring it all in. So we're saying that breakthrough, individual, organization, and to movement. To get to the movement level, we must understand that working within our organizations are insufficient. Once we accept that we must work at a movement level and we need organizations collaborating and working, we must understand that each organization is actually oriented about within five different strategies. Some organizations might be oriented to 1, to 2, to 3. They might subscribe to a couple of them, but most of us are oriented implicitly, meaning that we don't have language to say, you do this, I do that, to actually understand the difference on what we're trying to say, okay? So to explain the theories of change in another way, is, as I was saying, from the teacher that does personal transformation and the teacher that says, whatever I do, I'm gonna get my students, even if it's 5 or 10 of them, to go through this process so that they can, you know, have a better life. They can make a decision that the best way to do that is not to do personal transformation alone, but that maybe they wanna do alternatives. They wanna be able to create their own school. Maybe I'm just gonna take and create a better school for 30, 50, 100 students. Do an alternative school, figure out how to resource it in a different way, go get to my teacher buddies that we agree on curriculum, we agree on the kind of culture we want to create in the school, right? So maybe they can take that path. Or they can say, you know what, I want to change my school system. I want to go and do some inside game. I want to go and do a lobby day for teachers, where we go and advocate, tell the stories of what we have, not enough books. Why don't we have enough resources? Why are classes so big in the classrooms, right? I can do the insight game. But I can also say, you know what, insight game is not enough. Maybe I need to do structure-based organizing. I need to join the teachers union. And I got to join a union of teachers where we can, have more collective power within the school. And maybe we can have more campaigns to run our own candidates to be able to do more change within the school system. Or we can also say mass protests and say, we need to do teacher strikes. We need to not go to work. We need to massively non-cooperate to bring light to the issue of the crisis in our schools. So in some ways, the same problem, but many different strategies to solve it, right? So those are the 5 theories of change. And if you've been following, and again, as I said to you, we do this training in 4 days. This session takes like 6 hours. We do a pie and the people talk about it. You map it all out, okay? We have webinars, you can see them as well. We're trying to make it short for the moment that we're in. But if you're beginning to see, you notice that these theories of change or strategies are actually quite interdependent. They kind of need each other. Personal transformation can really help alternatives. Alternatives can really help community organizing, right? We can see how community organizing can help mass protests. We can see how mass protest explodes everything, makes a lot of momentum in an issue, and then that can help everyone in the ecology. We can see how the insight game can pull those resources, political points that the movement is organizing and translate it into concrete victories. We can see how there is interdependence within all these strategies of change. But actually, what we're also seeing is that there's a lot of conflict around the strategies or around these theories of change, that sometimes there's a lot of tension within these theories of change. And some of those tensions that we're seeing is that, first of all, because we don't have language to say you're doing something different, then we get into this battle of who actually has the strategy. My strategy only works kind of deal. Well, personal transformation is really awesome. Structure-based organizing, all of you need to get some healing because you all are clearly part of the dominant culture. You're too caught up in working in the steakhouse or working in that dynamic. You can see people in community organizing saying back to the people in alternatives, in personal transformation, saying to them, wow, like it's, I wish I had enough time to take retreats. I'm here organizing and overwork. So you can see all these conflicts sometimes within the theories of change. People in mass protest thinking everyone else might be a sellout, People in the insight game thinking everyone else is not as pragmatic as them. What are they doing? All this stuff. You got to come and see where legislators stand on a lot of issues, So you see all this, there's actually conflicts. But most of the times these conflicts are not taken that they're strategic conflicts, that they're conflicts because there's actually different strategies at hand, right? So we see a lot of dogmatism, a lot of purity culture. And then we also see a lot of individualism or self-sufficiency, meaning we don't need the other theories of change or the other strategies to succeed. I don't need this, I don't need that. We actually see a lot of that also happen within a conflict of the strategies or theories of change. But we actually have seen, and we'll stop here to see some questions, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts, Paul, on this too. But actually, from the research that we've done at INE for now some time, what we actually have realized is that some of the movements where we feel the most excited by the kind of response that they've been doing in their organizing and in their social change have been movements that have actually a very clear understanding and language around this series of change or strategies and how they come together. That particular collaboration is what we call movement ecology. Is to have ecology around all the strategies so that there's synergy among them. I don't know, Paul, but there's some stuff you would like to add in this quick intro that we do into movement ecology.
I would just say that we need all these strategies, especially in a crisis. And it really helps to have this language because we could start talking about this incredible need that can only be filled by an entire movement ecology. And when we're talking about the language of movement and moving from organization to movement, it's really embracing that we need this whole movement ecology to actually be successful. And if you take our longer trainings, you'll realize is when we look at movements throughout history that are very effective at making deep changes and responding to crisis, and being able to save people's lives at a deep level in the middle of a crisis, it's because they use all the strategies, and they use that in ways of great collaboration.
Thank you, Paul. If there's any questions to clarify, you can put them in the chat box. We'll be clarifying as we go. Great. Okay, so maybe Paul, you want to take us through this next part?
Yes. So right now, we're in an unprecedented time. There is this totally emergent movement ecology that is responding to crisis. And actually, this has happened a few times in history. There are big trigger events, and a lot of times there's these little trigger events. But in my lifetime, there's been these horrible disasters and catastrophes that have created new movement ecologies or emergent movement ecologies. One of them, like the Iraq War, the 9/11, the stock market crashing in 2008, Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina, all created new movement ecology, partly because it created this huge need to respond to a crisis, and there had to be sort of a movement response to respond to that. And in my experience, in my lifetime, if you can go to the next slide, this is the biggest trigger event that I have experienced in my lifetime. It is just horrendous. The level of what we're talking about, health experts that are creating models where hundreds of thousands of people are dying, millions of people dying, and that's a really good chance that that could happen. We have a cultural crisis. To respond to that, we all have to take responsibility at social distancing, and it makes it so that all these institutions like education, childcare, the market is not even functioning. And there's a stock market crash that is worse than almost anything that I've seen in my lifetime. It is bigger, much bigger. It eclipses what we saw in 2008. It's depression level unemployment, and people not having resources and being laid off in mass. This has created just tremendous amounts of needs, tremendous new political landscape. It's very disorienting because now everything, the whole spotlight, everyone is affected by this. And for me, one of the reasons why I want to do this webinar is because I feel that we're in this big of a crisis. We need movements to be able to be responsive, because the government and the healthcare system and the market can't respond to all the needs. For a lot of people in the world, that different crises they've experienced that crisis in like Argentina, where the economy collapsed in the past, but now we're all feeling it throughout the entire world. And in those environments where there's a gap, it's really a social movement response that can help and support the government and the market for meeting all the needs, and also hold government and the market accountable so that the most vulnerable aren't going to suffer and possibly die in this crisis. And I just want to tell a little story because it's so disorienting. This has happened in history a lot for organizers who are building organizations. And the way I was taught as a community organizer was in a school of thought that sometimes is called structure-based organizing. And Saul Alinsky is considered to be sort of the father of community organizing. Obviously, there's many other great figures in that school of thought, but Alinsky and one of his proteges, von Hoffman, had a very similar experience of thinking about how to reorient. In a much smaller trigger event around the civil rights movement, they were building community organizations in impoverished communities, in disempowered communities in Chicago, in the Woodland area. And they were taught to do that through relationships, to agitate people around issues that existed in the neighborhood, and slowly build support and education and getting people involved one-on-one, building small coalitions with churches and unions. And what they stumbled upon this moment when the civil rights movement was exploding, and there was this thing called the freedom rides, where people would take buses, desegregated buses with white and black people down to the South, where they were being mobbed by racist mobs of people that would bomb these buses and beat up people and even kill people in response, in retaliation from this activity. And so this community organization invited a freedom rider, somebody that was on a bus that was doing this type of protest, and up to Woodland community organization at a church. And they didn't think very many people were going to come because they were trying to assess their organization. And they realized, oh, well, our organization isn't strong. It's not going to bring people there. And so they had the speaking event, and like 1,000 people showed up, much bigger than so many people showed up that they couldn't even fit into the church. And this blew Alinsky and von Hoffman away. They had to reorient all the rules of community organizing because people were being activated and becoming leaders outside of any organizational rules and structure that they had ever seen. And they were analyzing this, and they basically said, we have to, in this moment of crisis that the civil rights movement has created, where the spotlight is on the pain and suffering of racism, we need to reorient. Instead of thinking about just organizing, we have to toss out everything we're doing organizationally and work from the premise that this is a moment of the whirlwind, that this trigger event has created a moment of the whirlwind, and we no longer are organizing, but instead guiding a movement. And that is the movement breakthrough. That's the breakthrough, is that I'm not just my organization, but I'm going to orient to a movement ecology. And that's the orientation that we're going to really be talking about, that we think is essential. But it really means we have to reorient everything, that we're all becoming part of a new emerging ecology, and understanding that and reorienting to that.
Thank you, Paul. And for the people that come to our movement ecology or movement strategy or seen our material before, we wanted to offer also today an easier way for us to see, because I know that we're all following a lot of news, but an easier way for us to really understand what we feel, Paul and I and us at INE, what we feel is emerging for the movement ecology. And we really think there is two responses that are happening in this moment, if we really put them in this new language. One, there's one side that is really about mutual aid, which is about coming together as a community to meet our needs collectively. We also did a workshop on mutual aid last week. I think we released the video today. So you can see that webinar if you're interested. It just goes into depth into that particular area that we think it's important for us to do, for all of us to do in this moment. And the other side is advocacy, which is demanding from the government, the state, or companies or the market to meet our needs on the moment. And we actually see that there will be this movement ecology. It's really going to have two arms or two sides to the coin, in one way to put it. There will be a big mutual aid movement side of this response and a big advocacy movement side of the response. Some of them interrelated, some of them isolated, but we see in some ways that the ecology is going to take these two big shapes. In, you know, it's already taking those big shapes, but it's going to keep going in that direction. And we actually think that there's 5 different things that we should all be doing as a movement to actually support the emergence of this healthy ecology. But before we get to tell some of that, I think maybe, Paul, you can tell us what are some of the factors that are changing that were different 3 weeks or a month ago into how we were thinking around the movement ecology.
Because it's so disorienting, that everything now has changed about how we have to do things. What we realize is it really helps to understand what are the things that dramatically change. What are the major factors for what to reorient to when we're thinking about a movement? And we really reduce them down to 4 things. One, there's massive amounts of people that need help and are agitated, and the traditional status quo can't meet those needs. It's overwhelmed, okay? So that means there's a huge space for mutual aid that wasn't there before. And no matter how much the structure-based organizations or the traditional organizations in the community cannot fully respond, and the status quo can't respond to all the needs. The second is social distancing has changed the way we bring people together, and that makes it so that even if there was this tremendous need out there, even if people could reorient, it's very hard for people to reorient and to develop the relationship that's needed to meet the need, because people aren't going to the regular churches, unions, community organizations in the same way, because they don't know how, because they have to reorient in this time of social distancing. The third is that there's massive amounts of people that want to help and be mobilized. An example of this, just to show you, and this is very different than how we've oriented before, which is a lot of times we have to develop and educate people so that they understand the issue or feel the pain, and are able to relate to the issue so that they can be a leader. Right now, masses of people want to volunteer, and we see this in many different examples. One great example is the BBC, the National Health Service, which is the nationalized healthcare system in the UK, made a call out for what they call volunteer responders. Okay, so to create a volunteer corps that is like first responders, and this is a big ask of people. I mean, it sounds very risky. It means you're joining the corps, you're getting training, you're gonna commit to a certain amount of hours to really be drafted into this huge level of participation to respond to this crisis. And they said, maybe in our biggest imagination, 2,000 people will sign up to do this risky thing. And right as of this day, 750,000 people have signed up. They actually stopped collecting forms because so many people have signed up. They can't process all the forms of people sending in forms that they want to join the volunteer corps. In the United States, the equivalent would be, the size of our population would be around 7 million people saying, I want to join the corps. Those people are out there in the United States, and they're feeling the crisis, and they want to be mobilized and support, but there isn't the institutions and the easy relationship for people to join. We see that also in well, one of our friends and movements that we do work with, the Sunrise Movement, they created this school for leaders that orient them a little bit to the coronavirus and also to how it affects the New Deal and the coronavirus crisis. And it was a pretty big ask. I mean, they were asking people for 4 or 5 days to commit an hour or two to getting on a webinar and learning and being a leader. And, you know, a lot of times when we're doing webinars, or you're expecting maybe 100, 200 people, 3,200 people signed up for this, okay? A massive amounts. And it just shows you people want to step up and be leaders at a very high level of commitment and sacrifice if we have the structures out there to make that ask. The fourth thing that is that the crisis has created is it has really created a total reorientation of how people think about social justice issues. Normally, people develop a consciousness through an issue in an organization, and they become more and more educated. Now, people are being educated outside of the traditional structures, and also they reorient their issue because each constituency is being affected dramatically by this crisis. So we have to reorient to that, say, okay, now how do we readjust the issue? For instance, with the criminal justice movement has done a lot to think about, okay, how do we protect our constituency of families that have people in prison and jail? How do we make sure they're not sacrificed and maltreated because of the coronavirus in the prison population? How do we expand releasing people that don't need to be in jail or prison, and expanding a response, a just and compassionate response. And we see that also in the labor movement. There's a huge reorientation, not just to doing the traditional issue, but talking about how to deal with labor issues, that because a huge mass of people are laid off, how do we do unemployment? How do we do labor rights in the context of this crisis? Everyone is reorienting to those issues. And it's very important to do that because the spotlight now is not in all these individual issues. It's really put on and is creating lots of suffering, lots of education, and lots of mobilization outside of the structures on this issue in particular. So now that we talk about how to reorient, and we're really talking about how to reorient to think like a movement perspective, how do we do that at the movement level to reorient? And we're going to go into thinking about what do we think is how to respond as a movement, and Carlos is going to take that.
Thank you, Paul. So we believe there's 5 movement ecology musts that we should all be doing during this moment. This is kind of our recommendations around the movement ecology for this particular times. So the first one, and we'll go through one by one, is that we really need to figure out how to support each other. And there's one part, which is how do we support each other, as how do we support the mutual that is happening, and how do we support all the advocacy that is happening, and how do we support the integration of these two. So we think this is first must. How do we tell each other that they both matter, that they both important? How do we begin to tell a story about each one and how they can collaborate with one another? So the first thing we always said at a training, please don't talk anything bad about the other strategies because we really need them, you know? And sometimes there's traumas that we have with the other strategies. We actually go through a whole thing on this, but it's really important in this moment that we hold the complexity of both and the difference of opinion of both about the response so that they can come together. There is also, of course, part of this that we really, as individuals, as organizations, need to lean into our larger movement for support as, you know, as people, you know, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. Like we built years of infrastructures and organizations. For us, this is our test for us to really support one another and begin to see that my organization can be healthy unless your organization is healthy, you know? And this is a new way that we have to really orient, and that we're seeing already people orienting this way. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything about this first must.
Well, I'll just say is a lot of times because of foundations, because of the way our organizations work in a movement ecology, there's a sense of competition. We have there's a certain amount of need that we're competing to serve, or we're competing to get resources to provide needs. There's so many needs out there right now. There's so much of a vacuum of both people wanting to help and support the cause, but also people in need. So that allows us to do collaboration at a higher level and not to be so competitive, but instead we say momentum creates alignment. Alignment doesn't create momentum. The crisis pulls us together and allows us to work together because the need is so big. There's no sense of competition. I want to say one of the musts that I think from everyone in the movement ecology, but especially as a movement as a whole, we have to start thinking about big ask. There's an army of people. There's millions of people out there, just like what we saw in the UK, that want to really drop out and volunteer, even if it means having a great personal sacrifice. People are trapped at their houses. They feel this deeply in their families, in their communities. They feel the crisis and they want to do something. But unless we have a vision of the big ask, and we're not afraid to create a vision that asks people to step up, and we see that already. One of the things we see is even some unions are doing some innovative mutual aid, like in Los Angeles, they're creating a volunteer corps. Unite Here and other people are creating a volunteer corps and getting lots of people to commit a certain, like a super volunteer program where they can ask people to make a really big commitment to join. One of the examples that I always say is that people would never imagine that the Catholic worker movement, which requires young people to drop out, live together, and commit to living a life with a lot of times with the homeless population and serving them, that would appeal to people. At this point, those sort of big asks to ask people to drop out, asking people to make deep commitments, even if it's in their home, to play big leadership. The only way we can scale up is if we make those big asks to develop volunteer cores of volunteer mass participation at a high level. I want to give it to Carlos for this. Oh, I guess.
Yeah, can you say that the popular demand and I'll do the other one?
Another thing is that in a movement ecology, we're seeing lots of different people make what we call instrumental demands. They're important. I'm not saying those are bad things. Instrumental demands are things each organization in the movement ecology, or especially structure-based organizations, they're making demands for local rent relief, or stopping moratoriums, or lots of little different demands for healthcare workers or for communities and neighborhoods. But those demands, or sometimes even at the national level, there's these laundry lists of policy recommendations, right? Big policy demands. These things are important and good, but what it's really missing is what we call popular demands. And what I mean by picking popular demands, these are demands that are designed to change the weather and mobilize people so that we can make the big ask. It's about what are the demands that resonate deeply in the public so that they will join a movement ecology and see themselves as part of a movement. And right now, there's some emerging, but we really have to, as a movement, think about what are the best popular demands, not just instrumental demands, and list of policies. Carlos,
you, Paul. Just to add to your point, Paul, I think that there was an organization of nurses in Massachusetts that released a 13-point demands that they needed in this moment. And that is very important. Those demands are very, very important. But we don't have a demand that all those demands can be part of. And because we don't have a demand that is popular, that resonates with people, that people can share with one another and say, protect our healthcare workers, or protect our hospitals, or my healthcare, or our healthcare, whichever one of those could be the demand, it's hard for us to really move the demands forward so that they can become politicized and they can be pushed forward. So how do we pick popular demands and not just all the smaller demands that we have? And the second thing is, like, once there are popular demands, because we've seen popular demands really emerge, like the people's bailout, giving people the universal basic income demand that emerged, I think, about a week ago, which feels like it was 10 years ago, but everything is going so fast, right? All those demands create all this opening that then we can actually, from the local and state level and national level, push. And that's really how we have to leverage them. So how do we embrace popular demands, and then how do we leverage them? It's a must right now for the movement ecology, for both the advocacy and the mutual aid. There's two more. One is must 4 is that it's time for a shared infrastructure. Right now, for example, I know that if you're an activist, or if you're a person connected to activist community or organizer communities, or people that are in organizations, most of us are already maybe in 2 or 3 or 200 different mutual aid groups that we've been able to join, to see, because we are already relating with one another. But I actually know, just from seeing, that I would say the majority of the population of the country doesn't know that there's a mutual aid locally that can work for them. You know, there is in some ways a gap in a lot of people seeing how to access the resources, or how to join in, or whether they should join in, whether what is a mutual aid network. You know, there's actually a big gap. And part of the gap is that we have a lot of infrastructure, but we're not building shared infrastructure. For example, I know there's some websites emerging, and then there's some Slack chats emerging as well, but we need those and 100 more, and even more coordinated, to create platforms for regular people to find mutual aid across the country. What if we will have a website where people can come in from all across the country, you know, to be able to share that infrastructure? Also, there is voter databases of millions of people in this country that organizations actually have, small local organizations that they have, that they could be giving to local mutual aid networks, you know, to be able to phone bank people, to actually even create a better list that is updated across the country, so that we can see who might have needs, who might even have the virus, who might need us, for us to support them a little bit more, who might be a family more distressed. We need much more infrastructure, and more shared infrastructure. And the last and the must five is that we have to contribute to creating a common identity. So there is a lot of different efforts happening in the mutual aid side and the advocacy side. We have to figure out how to create an identity that people, not just us that are in them, but people that are not in them, that they can see them as reliable, and that they can see them that they are in some ways 10,000 different efforts, but that they're somewhat the same thing, or that they're somewhat coordinated, or that they express some of the same story or the same, purpose of what they're trying to do. So for example, I come, from the immigrant rights movement and the DREAM movement. We used to wear caps and gowns and talk about the story of being dreamers. That became a unifying for a lot of dreamer organizations across the country. In ACT UP, an organization that responded to the AIDS crisis, they use silence equal death, the triangle symbol, to unify a vast amount of groups that were doing mutual aid and advocacy. So it's really important that the ecology begins to take shape, take color, take a way for people to see it, even in their doors. I know some people were doing for people to put different colors on their doors to identify whether they needed this or they needed that, and kind of having a standard system for the whole country. I think all those ideas are genius, because the more we can create a collective identity, even by doing the pots and pans at 8 p.m., the more the movement will have an identity and be able to attract more people and grow and grow and grow. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I just want to say, we can all contribute to this. Many of us and many of our organizations can't do all the must, but we can support all the things that we know need to happen for good movement ecology. Already there's bubbling up in people that are working constructively to do all of these 5 must for a good movement ecology, but they need support from all of us. So when we see this happening in the movement ecology, we want to move in that direction. And in that way, things can be supported and emerge that we need to actually create a movement right now, a real sense of a movement that can really scale up and create mass participation. And that's what we're talking about. Because right now there's lots and lots of things bubbling up, but it's not unified and collaborating as a movement ecology.
Thank you, Paul. So we have maybe just 3 more slides, and then we're gonna go into the Q&A and resource list. We want to respect the time that we set. But before we continue in this last kind of short part to bring it all together, we maybe want to take a deep breath for the people out there. Maybe take a deep breath, and maybe they'll disconnect my account, but we got to really socialize Zoom. Zoom should be a little bit less expensive. I just said it in a Zoom call. Maybe they'll cut my system, but let's take a deep breath. Let's take a deep breath as we enter into this last part. Great. So in this part, when we are doing this training and of movement ecology, and it's really complex because we try to bring people from all the different parts of the ecology. And people get into a fight. I mean, that is just the truth, and there's some movement therapy that actually we have to go through to actually really understand this interdependence that we have with one another. But after we go through this process, there's a realization that we have in movement ecology that actually everyone has a role. And that's not said in a way of like, oh, everyone has a role, please calm down. No. Like, actually, every role matters. The insight game matters. The structure-based matters, alternatives matter. Of course, each one of these strategies has sometimes a side that it's not very healthy, and we have to figure out how to have health within its strategy. But we realize that everyone has to have a role. So the way that we want to end this workshop is just we said what are the 5 movement must as a movement. Now we want to go back into the individual and an organization, and we want to share what do we think are the things that everyone as individuals, and by that we don't mean just activists, but we mean everyone on the population, most people should be basically committing to do to support the larger ecology. And then what should organizations do? So Paul, how about you lead us into the individual part?
So as individuals, in the study of social movements and civil resistance, a lot of times what is needed as an individual action to help support the creation of a common movement identity is what is called primary sacrifices. It's the little things that we can all do, the minimum thing everyone can do to help create a sense of unity and movement culture. And in the Indian independence movement, they built this around spinning because they realized that spinning and making your own cloth, the colonial British Empire really decimated the capacity for villagers to make their own cloth. And so they realized that the cornerstone of the movement was going to be around the spinning wheel as a way to create this, what they call primary sacrifices. And it's even part of the flag of India still to this day, is a spinning wheel in the middle. And it was incredibly effective at creating both a uniform and also an action that really unified people. So what is the primary sacrifice that we're talking about now in the coronavirus? We think that number one thing that creates a sense of bond of solidarity and gets everyone related is joining a mutual aid group, or being part of a mutual aid group. If you're already part of a church or a union that's doing mutual aid, or a 12-step group that's already figuring out ways to meet each other's needs during this crisis, okay? But joining a mutual aid group and supporting the mutual aid group at a minimal level. It doesn't have to involve all your time, but doing that a little bit gets you to feel a part of what we think is a mutual aid movement that can emerge. The second thing is advocacy, and that means taking a minimal amount of individual action around advocating for something, whether it's endorsing something, calling a legislator, protesting, or talking to others or educating others around an issue. We think one of the things that is really dynamic about talking about this, that everyone's in certain countries, a huge portion of the population is participating in these nightly sort of calls for supporting healthcare workers being in solidarity. And we think that can expand to being in solidarity with the workers who are being laid off. And it can expand to being in solidarity with everyone who's really suffering because of this crisis. But it allows us to have a sense that we are a movement from the bottom and among the public to respond to this crisis.
Thank you, Paul. So I'll do the one around organizational, at the organization piece. And before I share about some of the things that I believe organizations need to be doing within the movement Ecology, I just want to say that, and we were saying this at the beginning of the call, is that our movements, our organizations are not as strong as we would like them to be, even to deal with the crises that we were facing. You know, like, I think it's safe to say that, you know, that we were all trying to build a lot of things. We were trying to figure out how to maximize, but we haven't been prepared to deal with this crisis as it is, you know, as a movement, as many organizations. And because of this, we are all really reorienting. And I know there's a lot of fear that we all go through around making changes. There's also a lot of reactivity and tension sometimes within our organizations, particularly for the ones that that get resources or sustainability from their organizations. There's changes that are going to happen, you know. And one of the things that I just want to really say to that, like, this is a moment of whether we isolate or come together. And I really think for organizations, part of our reorientation is how do we come and join into this larger structure or infrastructure of the movement? Because if we do that, then we'll have more safety and even more ability to deal with all the needs that are happening, you know? And part of that reorientation that for us, we think it's important, or 4 things that really as an organization, people should do is, number 1 is a reorient to the crisis. I know if you're in this call, you already are thinking, how do I learn more things? I need to figure out this framework so I can have better conversations in my group or my org or in whatever I'm doing. So you're good. But if you're in an organization and your organization is saying, let's just cancel everything and let's just wait out to see what happens. No. You can't sit this one out. Like, really mean it. Like, we have to really reorient around the organization. And most of the times when we're in crisis, we tend to do only what we know. You know, we tend to respond we just try to double what we know. And actually we know that in this moments we have to start doing things that we don't know, and we have to reorient to the crisis. So that's the first thing. We hope this workshop, I know people are doing so many of the workshops, all the great workshops that are happening out there in this information, people can use it to reorient around all the different things they need to do in their organization. But it's important. That's 1. 2, if you're in advocacy, if you're an advocacy organization, you have to really be talking to somebody in mutual aid. You have to be everyone from across the country. If you're doing advocacy, you can talk to mutual aid. If you're doing mutual aid, find somebody that is doing advocacy around your same issue in your same area and your same context, and have a relationship, have a meeting, a weekly meeting, so that you can talk. so that you can start building the muscle of that relationship, so that you can start learning from each other, educating each other about what you're doing in each area, and create the potential for collaboration. I know that later maybe there will be a bigger coalition of all advocacy and mutual aid and a whole thing, but for now, the minimum that we all can do, if you're on one side of the spectrum, to talk to the other side, to build a deep relationship. And if you're doing both, then you're great. You know, you're working within the tension. 3 is share your infrastructure and ask from others. What do I mean by this? It's like, and this is a kind of a vulnerable thing, because if somebody calls me and says, Carlos, I know you have a list of activists. Can we email your list for some things? I might be like, well, that's my list. I built a list. I did this, right? Really, this is the time, of course, within the boundaries of respect, because we have to be respectful of our organizations. But it's really, we have to say, of course, let me send an email. Let's send an email together to my people if they're the ones that are really needed for your project. You know, I know a lot of people, as I said, have voter data and names of people that really need a call from our movement for the big ask that Paul was talking about, right? So how do we ask from others? If we don't have something, ask from others. Ask from your neighbors if you need some sugar or rice, you know, as we used to do in my neighborhood in Peru, you know. This is the time for that. And if you have something, share it, whether it's a skill, whether it's your list, whether it's your Zoom login, you know. I know some of us are sharing our Zoom logins. Do that, you know, so that we can share some infrastructure. And the fourth part is be open to being part of something larger. I know we all have our own organizational t-shirts, our own identities, and we feel proud of them. But it's also important in this moment that I feel, don't let go of who we are, but just add a new identity, of larger identity, where we also are saying that we're part of this larger mutual aid movement, part of this larger advocacy movement, part of this larger response, of this people's response that we want to have in this country, and of course across the world too, to really protect people and then change actually the problems that are creating this crisis in the first place. So those are some of the things that we think every organization, they're not big asks, they're actually minimal asks, that we think everyone could do within the movement Ecology. And I don't know, Paul, if you want to say any closing statements and before we pass it to Fatima.
Well, one thing there's that I really want to highlight, because I've seen it so much in the history of social movement ecologies, especially in disasters, like in the case of the AIDS health crisis, the AIDS crisis in the 80s, is that mutual aid and advocacy work really well together. But it's not necessarily easy to get people in mutual aid to start doing advocacy. And a lot of times it's not easy to get advocacy people to do mutual aid. And we really think they actually work super well together because it creates credibility, it creates knowledge about the problem, it creates a sense of really connecting and agitating it and being educated about the problem if you're doing mutual aid. And you can use that to become an advocate. And vice versa, the advocates can learn about the issue and then go in and do some basic mutual aid. Not everyone has to do everything, but it really helps that level of collaboration. And in some cases, the movement actually emerges into the same movement. Like in the AIDS healthcare crisis, mutual aid and advocacy became sort of the same movement identity. And really, we're really hoping that in time, there will be a collective identity and a collective shared structure. That's what we hope happens, and we want to support that. And we see that after huge trigger events. Sometimes that takes a while for that to emerge. I think it would emerge if social distancing wasn't here. I think we would already have people marching on the streets and doing mass protest activity and creating a collective identity. I think it's a lot slower now because we have to figure out new ways to build movement, collective movement infrastructure without our traditional mass marches and people just going out on the street, and also creating a collective identity.
Thank you, Paul. So before we go on to questions and answers, I did want to share that we have created a resource list. Carlos is bringing it up. Like we mentioned earlier, we do have a whole 4-day training on movement strategy. Which delves more deeply into what we've shared tonight. So there's a lot more material related to this, and the resource list isn't all inclusive, but it includes some key items. So what you'll notice is in the first section, there's just 3 readings that we've chosen to include as supplemental reading on movement ecology. The second section right below that includes examples of responses in this moment according to each theory of change. We mentioned some examples already, but there's also some additional ones so that you can find links to a site guiding people to make care mass covers under personal transformation, or articles on wildcat strikes under mass protest. And we also added a couple of golden nuggets about mutual aid, since that's related to personal transformation and alternatives. If you keep scrolling down at the bottom of the page and on the second page, you'll find more information about the rest of the theories of change. And then a golden nugget on advocacy underneath inside game, structural organizing, and mass protest, since advocacy is related to those. And then underneath that on the second page, there are the 4 factors and links to examples and articles that we mentioned during the presentation. I saw a couple people ask about documents or things related to that. And then last but not least, you'll find the 5 movement ecology musts. And we'll be adding links with examples in the coming days. So let me share that on the chat. We will also be sharing the list over email to those who registered. And if anyone that you know wasn't able to come on, if they register in the next day or two, they could still end up on the list. And then just wanted to share as well about some other webinars that INI has done and will be doing. Last Thursday, some of you were there, but we did a webinar on the strategy of mutual aid. We shared the importance of it as a strategic response to this crisis. And we explained the difference between mutual aid and services and shared some basics to start a mutual aid network. We do have the mutual aid video recording, and I'm linking that in the chat, and we'll also link it in the email so that you all have it. We're also doing a survey on mutual aid. So since we did a webinar last week on it, we wanted to understand more what's important related to mutual aid to cover in the future, and then what educational resources are related to the topic. Let me share that on the chat. And then upcoming webinar next Tuesday on April 7th, we're sharing important introductory frameworks and resources to help with building emotional resilience. So we've been talking a lot about strategies of response and theories of change related to that, but we know we need more emotional support, and that there are traditions, practices, and resources that can help us strengthen our resilience. So that's really what that's about. And we know that even though there's a lot of uncertainty, we can grow our awareness of what's going on for us and the people around us, so that we really have more capacity to go through this transition together. And let me link that. I know it's a lot of links, but they'll all be in the email as well. Let me share the resource link as well. And great. Could we go to the next slide? So we have various questions that were coming in. I'm just going to go through some of them, and then Carlos and Paul can decide which ones to answer. And like Carlos mentioned earlier, we are going to figure out a way to answer each of the questions, even if we don't get to them tonight, since we're reaching the end of our 90 minutes together. And then if we go over, for anyone who wishes to stick around, we'll also continue to answer questions. Okay, so let me go with the first 5 that came in. This first one is from Rachel. Do you think the separation or social distancing will accelerate the integration of digital mobilizing strategies? And what do you think is needed to help movements leverage that potential? And then from Ryan, where does mass civil disobedience fit in the ecology of movements? It seems different from mass protest. What is the value of this technique? For example, mass tax and or rent avoidance, mass arrests, mass debt refusal. From Aaron, I'd love to hear some examples of movements that currently are or have in history used movement ecology and integration particularly well. She said we might be about to get this answered. It was right before we shared on the civil rights movement. And from Hema, was the Trump election a small trigger event? So that's one set there. I'll let you think about it for a sec before answering the question.
I don't know what you're thinking, Paul. Well, I can just say on the Trump piece, yes, Trump was definitely a trigger event moment, I think, for a lot of people. And if you notice, once Trump succeeded and there was all this momentum and all this activity that happened in universities, there's a lot of activity that happened. There was a women's march that happened in January. So there was all this reaction and capacity where things were different. So yeah, definitely a big moment of the whirlwind, the Trump election. Paul?
Comes to shared infrastructure, there's been a lot of examples in the past that we talked about good movement ecology, but the Occupy Sandy was a real interesting thing of creating a shared infrastructure around mutual aid in a crisis and a shared identity. I think Chloe mentioned that in the comments. We also see that in the AIDS crisis, and that there was a collective identity and a mutual aid movement that was working with advocacy in responding to that crisis, that epidemic of AIDS that ended up with horrific impacts, with hundreds of thousands of people dying in the United States and millions of people around the globe. And the only other thing that I would say is we just have to understand that how do we absorb all that energy? Each person has a responsibility to absorb. That's what movement ecology is what we're talking about. Each piece of the pie can absorb different people. And we can't think that one piece can just absorb everything, but we do need a collective infrastructure that basically fills in a huge gap that no matter how good the organizations do to adjust to involve more of their members or more of the people that they're connected to, a movement is what creates the framework for mass participation, like in Occupy Sandy, like in whatever Occupy Wall Street, that absorbs the energy more than just any individual part. It's more than the sum of the parts. And I do think there's a place for mass protest, but what's really hard is because of social distancing, mass protests, it has to do things that I think is really important for it to be popular, that it can't be seen as resisting the efforts. It has to be seen as part of supporting the effort, the collective effort from government, market, and everyone. And I still think you can do mass arrest, but it's a lot harder because the action scenario of mass arrest kind of contradicts some elements of social distancing and can be seen within messaging to be obstructionist. And we got to make sure that we can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add from those questions, from what you were saying, Paul, around there's a lot of activity that people can do right now. For example, let's think about the problem that we have around rent, right? So I know that within personal transformation and sometimes within services, we're thinking, how can we figure out how to find money to pay people's rents? And that's important, and we need to figure that out. But also in mutual aid networks, what we can do from the mutual aid side of things is that we can actually form groupings to talk to landlords, because a lot of people, what they are is scared to talk to their landlord, because the landlords get so aggressive, So like, how do we find mutual aid around? How do we have landlord conversation support groups? Hey, we're gonna talk to your landlord together, or at least I'll be on the phone with you while you talk to them. It decreases the tension, might feel easier for that. Once we build the mutual aid, then it's easier for us to say, well, through our data and through all the conversations we have, there's like 1,000 landlords in this area that we can totally, and we have all the neighbors in conversation. Why don't we all just do a letter together and we don't pay rent together? And we say that we now have one representative. So we can move the mutual aid to the advocacy and really the disobedience also very quick when there's a combination of the strategies, right? Somebody also asked if civil disobedience, where they fit. It's a complex question, because I think people in civil disobedience as a tradition might feel like the tradition takes different parts of the movement ecology, right? But for us, we put civil disobedience as a particular action of disobeying a particular system within mass protest. You know, that's where we would fit them.
The only thing I'd add there is that in the 4-day training, we also talk a lot and make a distinction between a theory of change and a tactic. And so I think in the question, Ryan, that you were asking, it sounded like you were mentioning it as the value of it as a technique, as a tactic in particular, and just wanted to mention that differentiation as well that we make between a tactic and a theory of change. Great. Let me keep going with the questions because we have a vibrant questions that were asked tonight. Andrew asks, are there any essays or books that movement ecology suggests? Any good philosophers or theorists that have influenced your thinking after network theory, ? Jesse, there's a difference between being opportunistic and reactionary. So many of the responses I've seen have been in the lane of what people have organized around pre-COVID, but reactionary, very focused on the immediate needs that the current crisis presents. I've read about workers going on strike, asking for protective equipment, but I haven't seen anything about using the strikes to also ask for collective bargaining or long-term healthcare contracts, which are some of the underlying big asks that the labor movement has pushed for. PPE is an immediate need, but isn't being tied to the larger asks. If PPE needs are met, the strikes don't continue. How do we reconcile meeting immediate needs with winning these bigger asks? How do we make sure that we're taking this moment to leverage the asks we want, not just reactionary ones? And let me ask one more. Marina asks, the biggest question I have whenever I think of movement ecology and theories of change now and before is we have all these bases to build from, but they have never achieved ultimate liberation. So how do we compare failed movements and the ecology of failed theories to not fail once again? I'm not saying those movements didn't achieve incredible things, but we're basing our futures on failed successes. And from Sophie, where can we begin with shared infrastructure when it feels like so much is happening so fast? Additionally, thinking about tech access and literacy and familiarity with mutual aid language and framework. So that's one set of questions. I'll give you guys a bit of time to think about answering one or any of them.
Thank you, Fatih, and please pitch in too. I just want to say I love these questions. And I don't think we have maybe super answers for them more than just thoughts more about how to dig in more into them. Maybe, Paul, you can take about the movement ecology theorist and go a little.
We do have a long list of theory and books around movement ecology that we give people who take our 4-day. We just gave you the introduction, and if you do the funding report, there is some in the index, in the appendix. There's a lot of sources there that are really good. But a lot of the theory is based on these examples. The MST, the landless peasant movement in Brazil, Sarvodia. We look at socialist movements across the globe that had amazing movement ecologies when they were successful at winning some big structural changes. So we have a whole list of books and things that we base that off of. And then also we've been very influenced by the work of Joanna Macy and Bill Moyers, are just some other two theorists, and civil resistance in general.
Thank you, Paul. I think on the question that Jesse said, I mean, it's a big question. I think it's a question of organization, the way that I see it. I think that workers, it's a question of organization in some ways, because how do we do political education in the moment that we're in to choose larger demands? And how do we have enough organizers? Like, in some ways, I think everyone should become an organizer right now. Like, I think everyone should be like, okay, what is the which place, we don't have enough organizers. In the labor union should think, how do we have 50,000 more organizers across the country assigned to different warehouses or to different stoppages, so that we can have the dialogues and the conversations around the real demands versus the immediate demands. We want to frame it that way, you know? So I actually think how do we use the moment of the whirlwind and the trigger event to also politicize people and build organization and do absorption is a humongous question, if it is for us to hold some of those real demands. But I love that question. It's so precise, you know? And I see it in immigrant rights as well right now, you know? Like I actually don't, for me, I think the real question right now, if there will be a strike of immigrant workers, is legalization. I think if there was an organized strike, we could legalize 11 million people in a month. I really think it's possible, because the dynamics are so prime that the workforce is so volatile, you know? But most likely people in my community will only ask to give some sort of, you know, relief in the moment that we're in, and not the bigger demands that actually create structural change.
I'll just say a little bit more is that people a lot of times think that that radical instrumental demands and popular demands for movements are contradictory. And I actually think history really shows that they're complementary, right? We need popular demands that might be seen as reactionary, but they do bring in people and polarize the public and create. Right now, Trump's response to the coronavirus is seen as really positive. He has the best approval rating now than he's ever had in his presidency. So in that environment where he has credibility, it's a lot harder to win radical instrumental demands at the local level, state level, and at the national level, especially at the national level. So when we create a pressure in a popular movement, new things become possible. But I have seen some less reactionary instrumental demands, especially at the state level in California and progressive states, New York and things, from community coalitions that are popping up. And I think there's a interplay between popular demands and radical non-reactionary instrumental demands that can work really well together. And we see a lot of examples of that.
Thank you, Paul. Would you mind giving an example of a complementary popular and instrumental demands?
Well, I think things like stay-at-home pay is so that is something that can really agitate, and lots of people can understand that we need some sort of universal basic income during this crisis. Well, a lot of people on the state level are pushing for unemployment reform at the national level, which is that change is a huge change in capitalism, to change the unemployment system that lots of people have been fighting it for a long time. And so creating the popular demand allows people to win that at the state levels, like in California, to make unemployment actually protect workers that get fired for unjust cause, or to actually make it so that it actually pays for a larger portion of their income, or even be a full compensation if they get laid off or fired. That's a huge change in law, and I think pretty radical. But we need the popular demand so that we can win it at the local level.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to those who have stuck around with us. I'm going to share some of the other ones that were also asked. And then, yeah, we can go from there. So Chloe asks, are solidarity actions in the mutual aid category or advocacy? Claudia asks, what do folks know in terms of what's emerging around a common identity? Senora Fiegelman asks, can you all comment on the different kinds of labor that tend to support different leverage points of movement ecology? How can we avoid uneven labor? For example, race, gender, socioeconomics, and emotional versus executive labor efforts. And from Serena, one, how do we combat the oversaturation that is emerging in terms of digital organizing? Is that supportive in terms of capturing more people, or is it detrimental without a unified identity? And two, how do we move from list building to power building? And how do we make sure organizations and or movements understand the difference? And then one more from Ryan from earlier. In addition, how does civil disobedience fit with the other parts of the movement ecology? How can we promote the idea of a movement of movements when there is friction between some of the different approaches? The notion of nonviolence is different for different people. How can we bring organizations together when different tactics are used and therefore different moral dilemmas? Vibrant, juicy questions.
Can I answer just one, and then can I pass the rest to you, Carlos?
Oh, are we playing that way? Okay.
Well, you could throw some back at me, but I just want to say the solidarity stuff. I think this is really interesting because I think that the solidarity actions are like a lot of tactics that it really depends on what your strategy is. So some people are using solidarity, like the nurses want to use solidarity actions to actually educate and polarize around the fact that we need more solidarity for these healthcare workers that are being abandoned by the government, and agitate a narrative or a message that actually is an advocacy message. So a lot of that really depends on, some people are just showing up to do solidarity actions around mutual aid, and that's the way they think about it. But I think that there's a real potential, especially if the nurses union and people like Jamie from the Flowbots is very active at really using solidarity actions to build a narrative that is about advocacy. First for healthcare workers, but for other people too, for workers and whatnot. And there's already some talk about that, to have a broader message for solidarity actions and using it to build lists, using it to build a Facebook group that then can agitate people and really help people connect to a larger advocacy movement as sort of a first step for a lot of people.
Thank you, Paul. I know it's already 9:13, so maybe we can just say last closing statements so that we can let people go. To some of the answers to some of the questions, I mean, they're juicy questions. I think we got to keep talking about them. I think the question on the oversaturation of digital, I think, Serena, that you're asking, I think it's important for us, yes, there's oversaturation. I think there is. And I think it's just the nature of the moment that we're in and the crisis that we're in. And I think we're basically learning the boundaries around how to manage within the people that are quarantined or not. You know, I think there's there is saturation that will happen. I'm not sure if that's bad as much, but I think, you know, boundaries will eventually start coming up more and more, I will say, with the space. I think it's important to be I think for me, and I see it also for other organizations and for the people that I coach and support on a regular basis. I call them, you know, we've been quarantining now for a lot of weeks, but you have to take 1 or 2 days to think every week, and not be in any conversations, and just think, and that is so important, because what happens is that the news every day was just reaction. So how do we, and the technology is also allowing us to do that. That's part of the saturation. So how do we take a little bit of time, and we're able to slow down and stop and actually sometimes, well, I cannot let go of things because the damage will happen and this and there. We have to cut some stuff in order to figure out how to respond better. Because what I have seen in moments of the world or trigger events before in my life, and I've been through quite many as an organizer, is that I've been to rape responses where, you know, the largest rape response I had was 800 people got taken from a factory and put in detention centers all at the same time. So that days matter, the hours matter. Like, you make a mistake the first week, the third week doesn't matter. You already didn't cut up. So there's something around emergency response that I think it's important to really think through and to slow down, and to say that to really slow down in some of the tools and stuff like that. And yeah, so I'll say that about that. I'm not sure if I answered the question. And the last thing that I'll say before leaving is that I just want to say that you know, Paul and I and others like Romano and Cecilia Lee are part of a training institute called Momentum that Paul and I were part of as well as early founders of that. And we develop a lot of thinking with them, and the whole community has developed a lot of wisdom and knowledge around what we call movement DNA, which is all the details of the movement. This is just one thing, which is in the strategy section, but on the structure around how do we distribute roles, how do we create a healthy movement culture, there's a whole wisdom of knowledge. So I would really recommend people going to, I know that I'm not sure Momentum is doing a lot of trainings right now, just because I'm also overwhelmed with everything I'm seeing, but I know they have a lot of materials and a lot of information available out there to create more information out there. But there's a whole thinking about how to do movement DNA, how to create a new movement, how to do front loading, how to react in trigger events, and Paul and I were so intense into being part of that experience so many years ago, because we were beat up by trigger events. Essentially, we saw trigger events and we were like, oh my God, that was a thing. And we did not even figure out how to react. So the training became a way for us to figure out how to prepare better, So I'll end there, and I don't know, Paul or Fatih, if you have any last thoughts, but I hope that we'll try to answer more questions. We'll do a document and we'll do voice recording to try to answer as best we can, but hopefully we can keep the conversation going. I don't know, Paul or Fatih.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything to add. Just super grateful to everyone that was here with us tonight, and a reminder that we have to go through this whole process of downloading the video and getting it ready. So it might take us a couple of days, but we will send you the video recording, all of the links, and then also all the information for the last webinar on the strategy of mutual aid. Again, if you know of any people who you feel would benefit from this webinar tonight, or from the strategy of mutual aid, they can still sign up today or tomorrow to the registration form for the one for tonight, and they'll receive the email. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Hugs.
Thank you, everyone.
No, thank you so much.
See you all soon.
Yes.